Hello, I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the Department of Anglophone Studies at the University of Antananarivo, and today we're going to be looking at a very important aspect of any research project, of any writing that is grounded in the discussion, the dialogue, and the findings that have come before. We're going to be talking specifically about literature reviews and how you incorporate information into this. So this is grounding your research, incorporating sources into a literature review. So we have 5 main focus areas, 5 learning objectives that we have today. The first is to understand the core principles of literature reviews. What are they supposed to do? Why do you write them? Then we're going to look at a sample literature review assignment to better understand some of the ways that this can come into play. We'll look at a published literature review article, an article that itself is a literature review. Then we'll look at what we call an implicit literature review, where the literature is being reviewed, but it's not necessarily in a section that's called a literature review, but it has the same function. And we're going to finish with a discussion with exploring electronic literature searches, with the goal of developing an understanding of the resources that you might be using to assist yourself in the process of finding information for your lit review. So let's dive in and look at some of the core principles of literature reviews. Some of the purposes of literature reviews include demonstrating that you have an understanding of key literature related to the problem or issue within your topic. Now, in keeping with some of the previous discussions in this workshop series, remember that you might be defining the problem as a lack of knowledge or lack of clarity about what something is or what it represents. And so by looking at the literature that has been written to date, if you point out, oh, this hasn't been discussed, or someone said this is important or this is the next step to do, but it hasn't happened yet, that is very helpful. And one of the other things you're supposed to be doing in a literature review is to demonstrate that you have not only reviewed, but you've critically evaluated the prior research in the field. Now, someone may have explored a topic that you're interested in, but if they have missed something, or not been aware of information that you are, or other things like that, well, that is certainly a reason to go in and expand to build on that. And another reason is to provide evidence and context to support what you're doing, to support the case that there is a need for new research, that it is guided by what's happened before or informed by that, that you are creating a framework for understanding how to interpret findings and not trying to create everything from scratch with all the challenges and the lack of clarity, lack of validation, lack of prior precedent, and that you understand the future implications or create the basis for understanding how whatever you discover, derive, or conclude, how that relates to what may happen next. Are there practical applications? Are there implications for understanding what someone meant by something or how it works, perhaps? And you do also want to credit other researchers for their contributions. If you take their ideas without giving credit, that's plagiarism, and that is not good, not acceptable. And also to identify gaps in the literature. If you review the key literature on something and say, but there's not this thing yet, that's a gap that you can help fill. It also helps you avoid unnecessary duplication. Now, I know that some students in the Department of Anglophone Studies are very interested in translation. And translation is a wonderful thing that sometimes involves a new need or a changing need. You may say, oh, there is an earlier translation of this work into this language. However, it doesn't do this, or it doesn't speak to today's audiences in the same way because of X. As an example, I'm a great fan of the poetry of Charles Baudelaire, who did come to Madagascar and did come to Mauritius and other places that I've lived. And there is something where there has been a shift in some of the meaning or context of language, where things that he said, while they would have been clear to readers of the early English translations where there are different associations, different implications, and so it's not that that previous translation was bad per se, but that it doesn't speak with the same clarity to today's readers as it may once have, or it may have prioritized or emphasized different things. Translation, you can pick, you want to keep the cadence or ring of the lines, you can say, I want to have it as literal as possible, but you usually can't do both. Usually it's impossible to capture everything in a translation, and that's why it's something of a art versus a science, and also why it is so interesting to be able to read a poem in translation and see how different details shine through more clearly. And so if you were, say, writing a translation process for your thesis, you would certainly want to identify the previous translations that have been done, if they exist, and also explain what their pros and cons are, what their strengths are, and what their weaknesses, or why they aren't appropriate or aren't as focused on the thing that you are doing. And thus, you've not only acknowledged previous people's work, credited it, you've clarified how yours fits in relation to them, and also how it will complement them. So, if we're going to distill this idea into a couple principles, principle one would be identify a narrow topic or issue. You don't want to go too broad, because broad things require an awful lot of time and energy, and we want you to be able to graduate on time, or if you're working on an article, to finish the article and get it published so you can move on to the next thing. So start by stating a clear and specific topic, issue, or other focus for your literature review. If you were to, say, be writing about teacher attrition, that's really too general. Are we talking around the world, in a specific country, in a region, in a subject area? Now, if we said, the topic here is high teacher attrition at Malagasy public schools. Okay. But it's still talking about a big country. We've got 26 million people here and lots of different regional variations. Now, if you've made it specific to a particular area, like, say, high teacher attrition at Malagasy public schools in Analamanga, then we have a much clearer idea of what's in scope and what's out of scope. Now, second principle, have and state clear boundaries. What are the limitations of what you're doing? And one of those is being clear what the delimitations are. So delimitations are rather like drawing a box around your research, where you say, these are the things that we're choosing to focus on, and whatever's not in that box is not our focus. It might come up briefly, but it's not going to be the focus. So when we're talking about having a focus in a particular region, that is both narrowing things and delimiting it to that particular region. And it doesn't have to be a physical place. It could be a time, geography, a language of publication, a particular population, or things like that. And so what are these boundaries? What's within the scope and what's outside of the scope? So if we're focused on Analamanga, what's going on in Majanga is not really super relevant. Yes, you might find some things that are interesting to compare, but is that going to be your focus? Not unless you're trying to find out the best practices in other regions and apply them there, in which case you would be discussing a specific targeted section. Principle number 3 is to align your literature review with a draft research question or research questions. What is it that you're specifically trying to answer? And make sure that your literature review is focused towards that goal. You want to make sure that you're providing and discussing information that's related to the underlying problem. You want to make it clear that the research question that you're trying to address hasn't been answered or hasn't been fully answered yet, which could mean, you found something where they looked at one school in Tana, but not at things in all of Antananarivo or in the larger Analamanga region. Make sure that the literature review isn't answering the research question itself. And I'll say caveat, make sure that you aren't answering the research question itself in the lit review unless your whole project is a lit review. Now, that's a particular genre. It's less common for master's thesis, but we'll actually be looking at an article that is a type of lit review, a systematic review of the literature. Now, those tend to be very specific on topics that are well studied, where you're trying to find the kind of thing that can only be answered with multiple studies, so less likely to be done for a master's thesis. But whether you are answering the research question itself separately after you do some study or information gathering, or whether the purpose of the article is to review the literature, make sure you state up front what the literature review is designed to determine. Now, it's helpful to keep in mind that your research question is probably going to change as you embark on your work, because you learn things during the process that help you decide whether this is something feasible, whether it's more practical adjusted, if there's something that particularly compels you, or that you get access to something. So your research question will probably change, and thus your lit review will evolve in the course of writing a thesis or a dissertation. Don't fret, don't worry about that too much. Principle number 4, show us your search process. This used to be less common in the humanities, but with the rise of global electronic library access and other things like that, it's very helpful to show where you looked and how, what was reviewed and what wasn't reviewed, because that will help other scholars build on your research and also help you know what you're going to be working on. You know, if you never stop looking at new literature, you're never going to finish. But if you say, okay, the literature review covered material published up to such and such a year, oh, okay. Even if you yourself are revisiting the research later, it's helpful to have that note to go, oh yes, I stopped looking at things in, say, 2020 so I could focus on writing and finishing. So show your search process, and I recommend that you include an actual section with its own heading that says where you searched, the search keywords or keyword strings, basically what you typed in for your search, any other restrictions that you might use, like a date restriction or peer-reviewed journal articles only and things like that, and the number of sources that you reviewed in detail. And we'll look at some ways that you can present this information later. Next principle, organize your information. It's awfully easy to keep reading and then forget what you learned. So if you are starting with not only having good note-taking, but also with working systematically in how you organize your information, starting with, okay, tell us what information or what types of information you're going to be paying attention to and why. And this is usually driven by a theoretical or conceptual framework. And because that information would affect how everything you discuss is interpreted by the reader, I recommend putting that section near the start of the body of the lit review. And tell us why you're discussing specific studies. You know, what makes those particular findings that you're relaying important. Principle number 6, analyze and synthesize. You want to have analysis and synthesis in your document. So you don't want to just be summarizing, so-and-so said that, so-and-so said that. That doesn't tell us if you agree with it, doesn't tell us if it supports, if they agree with each other. So start each paragraph with a topic sentence that makes a claim. Give us evidence, grounded in the literature, that supports that claim. Sometimes you'll have argumentation, but you're going to want to be grounding within the literature and in data as much as possible. And use logical bridges to show us how the different information fits together. So when you are analyzing, when you're comparing or evaluating the information, use phrases like this contrasts with or this aligns with. And however, this is important because, or this is less generalizable because. And when you're giving new meaning, when you're weighing in, when you're showing what this means or what the expected implications are, show us that synthesis with logical bridges, like therefore, and this suggests that. Other tips. Before you start writing, ask yourself, what are the most relevant pieces of information that you need to convey? And does the structure of the literature review and the headings that you have within it, Do these provide a clear logical order? And is it clear to the reader where there are gaps in the literature? Now we're going to head and take a look at a literature review assignment. So literature reviews aren't just for theses and dissertations. They can come up in course papers as well, and articles. So here's an example assignment. The focus of the assignment is on creating a personal health record. And our interest here is point number 3. We'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so they say start with a brief introduction for the paper, include the information on the person being described in this record, and then, so there's some sort of healthcare intervention being proposed for this person who's described in this record, and to justify that decision, to justify the recommendations for action, the interventions, the writer here is requested to write a brief literature review that contains a minimum of 10 research articles showing why they're recommending things that they're doing. Now, I think you'll agree with me that if you're, say, getting brain surgery, you don't want your doctor to be making things up on the spot. You want to know that the procedure, the methods, it's the precise surgery that is happening, that this has been done before, usually, that it's been validated as successful. And one way that you might show that is by discussing related literature. Okay, what are the findings for this? When was this developed? How long has it been used? What's the success rate? What are the challenges? What makes it appropriate for particular circumstances? And does that align with, in this case, the person's health record information? So, why am I showing this to you? Because if you understand the function of a literature review, what you're trying to do with that, then that will help you determine what information is relevant and what is out of scope. Not saying it's bad information, not saying it's not interesting, but if it's not in scope, if it's not needed for justifying what you're trying to do, why spend time writing on it? Why spend time bothering the reader with it when there's a particular purpose or focus to fulfill? So let's go now into looking at a published literature review article. Now this article is coming from PLOS ONE. If you watched our last workshop recording, you'll know that PLOS ONE is a free peer-reviewed journal. You can access all of the articles online, and it's actually fairly high impact. It just celebrated 15 years, and we're going to look at this particular article, Moral Judgment and Hormones, a Systematic Literature Review. Now, we can take a look at the article itself, but I've gone ahead and I've excerpted some particular passages here. Now, one of the helpful things for looking at the journal article itself here, which is freely available online, doesn't require any password or login or anything, and you can even download it as a PDF here. We have our table of contents, and we can see how this was organized. So it starts with an abstract, which gives us a quick view of what they did. It's a systematic review looking for possible associations between moral judgment and hormones. They tell us where they looked, which is 6 major databases. And they looked in particular at 20 studies. That's where their focus was. And then they look at what those showed collectively. Now, the title here of this article says it's a systematic literature review. So systematic, they're trying to find everything that's on the specific thing that they're looking at, and then to look at what those say or what those convey in terms of meaning as a whole, which is something great because you are able to take the results of many different things, see, okay, here's the aggregate, here's the larger meaning that comes from that we can derive. All right, now I encourage you to look at this later, but we see that it's laid out in a nice organized thing where they tell us the introduction, why is this important? They have the method section where they go into, okay, here's what we did, how we did it, the results, what is basically what we found, and the discussion that's here's what it means, here are some of the potential implications or how it relates to the literature before. And then they've included some supporting information and the references here. All right, so let's take a look at our slides again. So I've excerpted here for easy readability part of the literature review where they explain what they searched and when. So it says here, the methodology of the present study was guided by the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, PRISMA. So they're saying, we didn't just make up how we did this. We're actually following a set of procedures for if you're doing a systematic review, here are the recommended steps for doing it. And those are laid out in PRISMA. So if you see this citation, the 33, that's a reference to a particular source that they use in this article. So if you were to be looking at this on the website, you could click on that and it would tell you where you'll find the PRISMA guidelines. Next sentence, they say specifically where they went looking. So that's a set of electronic databases, PsycInfo, PubMed, CLO, Web of Science, Scopus, and Lilacs. And those are really the big ones. Those are the biggest ones for this type of research. So yeah, looks like they went in all the right places. And they tell us, okay, they were looking without restriction in terms of language, and they weren't restricting by publication date. So they're willing to look at a wide range of stuff, some of which might be older. Some of it might be in languages other than English. And then they give us this whole string of the terms they use, the search keywords. And if you're not familiar with Boolean searches, this is actually a really good example because it shows you how to chain things together. So you'll see moral or morality are in parentheses and separated by the or. So either one of those words, and then either a hormone or oxytocin, a vasopressin, and then there's the whole string of other things that they're saying, okay, well, any of those things lined up with moral and morality will work. All right, and then they tell us when they did the search, that they finished their search on January 15th of 2021. So anything published after that point wouldn't be covered here. And that you can even retrieve the search results by going to this database called Prospero and entering the search ID that you have there in parentheses. That's the CRD 42020193991. So this very detailed. They say, okay, here's how we went searching, and we followed the PRISMA guidelines. Here's where we went searching, those 6 databases. Here's the specific things we typed in. And here's when we finished doing that. And you can even check our work, check our search, because we saved it in Prospero. Next, they tell us about how they determined, with all the things that came up from there, whether they were going to be looking at something in greater detail. These are the inclusion criteria. So they're looking for original articles with a particular type of research design, either observational or experimental, that they were conducted with adults or adolescents, so no small children, and they weren't screening people by their male or female, just where they had that age, and that the aim was to evaluate the associations between moral judgment and hormones. Exclusion, this is for reasons they might take something out of the pool that they're looking at in depth. Studies that did not use standardized methods for administering exogenous hormones, so that's like hormone injections and stuff, for measuring concentrations of endogenous hormones. So basically, if they didn't add hormones to the subjects and they didn't check what the hormone levels were in the body, then that was excluded from the review. And then they say, okay, well, so what do we count as hormones? Okay, we've used a list from Norman and Litwack. And then the 34 would show you the particular source. So for the purpose of this study, they took 4 different ways of writing things and said, okay, that's basically the same thing. Moral judgment, moral evaluation, moral responsibility, and moral decision making. And they used a particular program to help with managing this. It's called Rayan, and the reference will show you how to access that. And they also say, okay, we had 2 people who were working separately to check whether things should be included. This helps reduce potential research bias. and that if there were any differences in their list, they discussed them and then came to an agreement of whether to include or exclude something. And so they also did a manual search of the reference lists of the articles that they looked in detail to see if there were anything else that they should include that didn't come up in the main search. And they've included a figure showing how they worked on going from the initial searches down to the 20 that they reviewed. So we can see at the top here that they list the records that were identified in each of those databases using the search term. So 645 in Scopus, more than 2,000 in PubMed, almost 4,000 total. And then the manual search, it turns out, didn't identify anything new. They checked, but evidently the rest of their search was quite comprehensive. Now, with all these searches in these different databases, you'd expect that there'd be some things that would show up in more than one. So those are the duplicates, the extra search results for something you found elsewhere. So removing the duplicates took them down from almost 4,000 to just under 600. Now, that's a lot. Still. I'm sorry, I misread that. They removed 578 items, bringing the list down from 3,999 to 3,421. And then they went screening that to see what to exclude. And that's this records not included area on the right. So we see that they took out things that are just pure theory, other systematic reviews, because then that would be duplicating the results, doctoral dissertations, which weren't peer-reviewed, other things that go through the same rigor of review, like letters to the editor, things that involved animal studies and plants and such like that, studies that didn't assess moral judgment, and things that didn't assess hormones. And so all of this process has helped them winnow down that list from 3,421 to 20. And so ultimately those 20 were the studies that they included for their qualitative synthesis, which is one of the potential outcomes of a systematic lit review. Now, they tell us some more about how they did this when they were looking at these studies. How did they make sense of them? And they created a table where they tracked various things so that they could look at it in an abstract. That's that list of 1 through 7. And they said, you can you can write us and we'll tell you the exact set of protocols that we're using for reviewing these. And that they also had, they were following the checklist given by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. So another way of making sure that they were doing this in a well-informed, systematic manner. They're following in this case, an American national standard for doing so. All right. Now, if we take an excerpt of the literature review section here, we'll find sentences like this. Oh, for cortisol and moral judgment, in the heading, this group of studies consisted of 6 articles, and only one of them directly assessed associations between baseline court levels and moral judgment through an observational design. Okay, so that's our topic sentence. That's the big picture. And then they after identifying this defect or limited depth of the research, say, okay, the other studies, the other 5, were designed to evaluate the effects of acute stress and moral judgment. And so court was only a secondary outcome, not the main thing they're trying to track. But since it was tracked, they were able to look at some data on that. So it's telling us, okay, so here's the research that did this. Some of it wasn't the main focus, but it was still done, and so it's something that they were able to look at and say, okay, well, here's how much things varied. Now, there's more that we can look at with this article, but we only have so much time, so we're going to be looking at something now from the field of English literature studies. So, before we get into that specific, let's talk about the difference between implicit and systematic literature reviews. In general, a literature review again, is going to be demonstrating your familiarity with any prior pertinent scholarship, scholarship that's been written and published before. And you're going to use it to explain the basis of what you decide, what the conclusions you come up with, the actions that you choose to undertake. Now, in a systematic literature review, you're going to be documenting in formal detail where you searched, how, what was rejected and included. But in an implicit literature review, it's more likely that you're going to be briefly summarizing or glossing over the search review process. Not saying you can't do it. In fact, I do actually recommend that you do have a formal paragraph that lays out where you searched and how, in part because it will make your life easier when you're searching, and it will make your life easier when you're justifying to your committee why you did the things you did. But in general, implicit literature reviews tend to gloss over that process and focus on just cutting right to, here are the findings. So what's the strength of that approach? Well, it does tend to make things a little bit more concise. And it's also often done because you can focus on telling a story, a narrative. But it has a couple downsides, one of which is that there's less clarity about how you identified or prioritized different sources. How did you make sense of this? And it means that you're generally less likely to have a discussion of what the gaps and the exclusions are, what hasn't been done before. Or if you are presenting that information without having a detailed literature search method section, it's harder to make the case that something is a gap when they don't even know where you searched or how you searched. Also, if you leave your lit review process and that you're doing a lit review, you leave that implicit rather than explicit, then it's hard for other researchers and writers to follow up on your work and to check your work, since there's no trail to follow. So we're going to go ahead and look at a master's thesis about one of the classic American novels, Moby Dick by Herman Melville. This is the story of a white whale and the men who tried hunting it. It is hugely influential in American pop culture, in the imagination, in literary studies, and, frankly, the development of the American novel. So, this is a master's thesis by Emily Goodrum, who completed her master's degree at Oregon State University in 2002. And, like the other things we've looked at, it is something that you can freely access and download online. In fact, let's take a look at that. So, when you are going to an electronic thesis and dissertation database, most American research universities now have their own available, where you can access at least the last 15-20 years worth of stuff, often much longer as they go through and add the archives. But if you're looking for something older, there are commercial databases like ProQuest, Theses and Dissertations, that house these that you can retrieve them from. And if your institution doesn't happen to have access to that, just write a friend, send me an email asking for a copy, and I can obtain it and send that to you. It's not a problem. I get requests like that about every week. So if we look at the table of contents for this, we see that it doesn't lay out a specific lit review chapter. We have the introduction, and then a chapter called Ahab's Failed Hermeneutics, another called Perception, Resurrection, and Transfiguration, Complicating Polarities, Ishmael's Ever-Shifting Truth, and then the references. So the way this is organized is more topically. They're focusing on particular topics and discussing those in detail. So this is, as a master's degree in English literature, it happens to be giving a implicit lit review. And we can see an example of that here. Oh, the tragic emphasis has ignited inquiries beyond the formal outcome itself. Inquiries beyond, so they're talking about other things that people published on this. Examining the influences that changed Melville's direction and his own state of mind during the writing process. Now, if we look at the footnote for number 4, it says, though research on the literary and philosophical influences upon Melville during the writing of Moby Dick are too abundant to list in here, the work of Merton Sealtz is perhaps an indispensable starting point. So it's saying, okay, there's a lot that's been written on that. But here's the one that you should start with if you want more information on that. So it's acknowledging that there is stuff written on this, saying, okay, well, here's the most relevant. And it continues, it is a commonly held position that Melville's own tragic vision and growing pessimism had combined with the timely reading of both Hawthorne and Shakespeare to produce a tragic turn in Melville's novel. So it is a commonly held position. That's, again, a summative statement based on having reviewed the literature. And it says, also significant was the friendship that sprang up between Melville and Hawthorne during the writing. Okay, another thing, it's relaying a finding from the literature. And then to give support for that claim, we have, Howard Vincent describes the effects of these combined influences as the revolution of mind which led to Melville's genius, etc., etc. And then we have a number after it. Now, a little word about citations. There are multiple different systems for doing citations. Some of the more common ones, Chicago Manual of Style, Turabian, MLA, which is the Modern Language Association, APA, which is American Psychological Association. And now, which one you pick is usually going to depend on who your committee members are and what they're familiar with and what's most common in your field. So in my case, my dissertation was written in Chicago Manual of Style. Many of my students have used APA, some have used MLA. It depends on that. We're looking here at MLA citations. MLA citations, you mention the author and you mention the page number for that work. If there's more than one work by that author that you're citing in your bibliography, you give the title of the particular work. So we can sort those out. So this first one, the author is named in the very first line, Howard Vincent. So go to the bibliography section and look for Howard Vincent. And in whatever that work that is, we'd find this quote on page 25, which is why 25 is in the parentheses. Now, in the next two sentences, we have a discussion of Melville, the review Melville wrote of Hawthorne's book Mosses, and we have a quote from it. Now, there's more than one work by Melville in the bibliography because discussing his novel, Moby Dick, and other things that he wrote. And so to differentiate between them, we have Melville, so writing by Melville. Mosses, that particular thing, the thing called Mosses in the bibliography. And where in that? Page 541. So this is explaining where the information came from. And so you can see that here in this usage, we have a difference between informational footnotes and the citations that are giving the direct sources for things that are being discussed or excerpted, like quotes. So the footnotes are providing a kind of layer of commentary that is helpful to know, but kind of would disrupt the flow if it was in the middle of a paragraph. And then those parenthetical citations are saying, okay, well, here's where to find that specific thing. So you can see that this text, it is reviewing the literature. Does it happen to be in a section that's called literature review? No. So it's an implicit literature review rather than an explicit one. If we look at this bibliography here, we see the works that are referred to in those parenthetical notes. So we look for the author's last name, Barbour, Bernstein, Bowen, etc. And then when you get that specific copy of the book, the specific edition, you can look up the page number that's in the parenthetical citation. So, for example, if we're looking at the Barbour source that's listed in footnote number 2 on this page, the composition of Moby Dick, we see here, that is listed. That's the first item here in the bibliography. It shows you exactly where to find it. It's in the Journal of American Literature, volume number 47, which was published in 1975. Page range 321 to 360. Okay, all right. So this helps keep the references when you are just reading through the text, to keep them fairly concise while still being able to look and say, oh, yes, it's that author's work. Gotcha. All right. So we're going to finish up with a look at some electronic literature search resources, things you might use to look for sources on a topic. Now, we have a tremendous range of research topics that people are pursuing at the university, but some good places to start. First, what does the University of Antananarivo give you direct access to? And so we see that there are a variety of different catalogs and databases that we can look at here. And whether these are relevant to what you are doing is going to depend on your topic. But it's good to start with the general catalog and to see what comes up. Now, I'm guessing that you're probably already familiar with these, and we do have the librarians who can give you assistance with these specific resources. If you're looking beyond them, and I'll just briefly mention that there is a database of theses that have been submitted and approved. If you're going beyond these, let's take a look at some additional resources that might be handy. So some external resources, the British Library, so this is the National Library for the United Kingdom. The British Library has an excellent collection. It is what is called a copyright library, meaning any work that is published in the United Kingdom, the publisher is supposed to send a copy to the British Library. So it's very comprehensive for things that have been published in the United Kingdom. And it's got a pretty good coverage of other things as well. So a good starting point for English language sources. Gallica, that's the French National Library catalog. A similar thing, it is a copyright deposit library. And if you're looking for material that is in the public domain, then it is a really awesome resource because you can download entire books from there. And that is fantastic if you happen to be working with French language sources. Same thing with Google Books. Google Books now allows free access to public domain works where you can download the book wholesale, which is really great, especially if your local library doesn't have it. And those are in many languages. You can even find a lot of books that were published about Madagascar in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, perhaps your topic is a little bit newer. Well, Google Books does index, and so you can search a lot of newer works as well, just you're probably not going to be able to see all the pages. You're probably just going to see a couple. But it might be enough to let you know whether it's something you want to get access to through other means. We'll talk more about that later. Google Scholar is a free catalog. If you remember the examples from the Systematic Literature Review article where they were looking at Scopus and other databases like that. So Google Scholar is a similarly intended resource, and it will search things that are in Google Books as well. And its benefit is that it has a certain elegant simplicity to it. It is very easy because it's designed to look like their regular search. So let's say we are searching for Madagascar and frogs. So very quickly I can see, okay, here's some stuff that's come up. I want to look at research from the last couple years. Alright, a lot of things mentioning Madagascar and frogs. And I can even connect directly to this and get a PDF of it. Awesome. Now let's say we're looking at, well, Melville and Moby Dick. Let's say that that is your topic. And we can see, okay, since 2021, oh, actually there's been a book that was published about that. And here's an article, and you can see it's being discussed a lot. So there are many sources, and while one of the downsides of this is that it's not directly integrated into the university system for anything that requires special access, it is good for getting a quick search of what's out there and to see, is this a doable topic? Now, you can also go ahead and look and see, okay, I don't want to pay attention to citations. I want things that are focused on it. So it reduces the number. Okay, I want to see what's come out in the last year. Just in 2022 so far, that's fewer, but it's still 271. So that's a lot of recent writing about it. So let's say we're looking at Melville, Moby Dick, and Hawthorne. Okay, that's much more circumspect. Let's back it up, look at the last couple of years. Okay, it's come up a lot. So there's no shortage of these. You'd want to do some additional refinement of the search to find out whether it's totally within scope. And this is one of the reasons why often people will choose not to do a systematic lit review, because it's a lot of work to go through 1,300 sources. Now, would you be reading all of those in the entirety? No. There are other ways that you can help shrink this down. Or you might look and say, okay, this one's in Turkish. I don't read Turkish, so I'm therefore going to exclude that. And because this can create blind spots, it's helpful to document this. So I do recommend that, regardless of whether you're doing an implicit or explicit lit review, that you do somewhere describe how you did your search, what you excluded and what you included, and why. Okay. So, clicking in this, continuing on this, we have WorldCat. Let me scroll down. So WorldCat is a worldwide network of library catalogs. So let's just say that we are looking for one of these books that came up earlier. Let's say that we are looking for this book, After the Whale, Melville in the Wake of Moby Dick. So I'm looking for a copy of this, and I want to know, is there one in a library near where I'm going? So if I search for that title here, let's see what comes up. Well, the print book, here it is here. And if we look at this entry here, okay, we've got, it was printed in 1995, and it looks like there's a new electronic edition that came out in 2021, and it's also available in print. So let's say I want the print one, I want to go look at that new version in the library, trying to find a library near where I am. Now, if you're in the United States, you can use these postal codes, which is handy to know if you are asking a friend who is in the United States, can you get it to me? So if you'd ask me when I'm living in Minnesota, like, oh yeah, I live 10 minutes away from Dunwoody College of Technology. I can drop in on the library and copy a couple pages for you. Or, oh yeah, I'd love to excuse to go to the University of Minnesota, so on and so forth. So the helpful thing is that can show you where to look for something that you don't have access to yourself in wherever your local place, or even to determine if it is available near you. Now, there are other ways to input the location. It just happens that WorldCat gives you an easy way of looking up postal codes. Now, it does have international libraries that are in there as well, so I'll often go looking for something and say, oh, well, there are no copies of that in the US, but I'm going to France. Is there anything that's showing up in French libraries? And so you can look around there. It's also helpful if you're doing a interlibrary loan request or just asking a student to get this for you, if you give them a link to it in WorldCat, because then they can see what there is in relation to them. Now, you will, I'm sure when you're doing a literature search, you will come up across things that you don't have access to directly. And so if it's something you really want, I would say don't be deterred by that. See what the best way to get access is. If it's something that's available electronically, it requires a subscription, but you don't have that at the University of Antananarivo, that's fine. Ask a colleague. Chances are it's in a database that I have access to, so you can just send me an email saying, hey, there's this thing I'd like, can you get it to me? You can use something like WorldCat to see if it's in a library nearby you, near some place where you're going or near your friend. And you can also request copies via interlibrary loan. Let me explain what interlibrary loan is. So different libraries across the world participate in loaning networks, where sometimes they ship books around, but more often these days, someone says, well, I'm looking for these pages in this book, or this page is in this journal. Can you scan that and send it to me? And so they do it. And when I put in a request for the interlibrary loan through my university library, Abilene Christian University, usually within 72 hours, they send me an email saying, hey, we got your stuff, downloaded. So even if it's something that's not in a library near me, if it's a journal article, chances are it's available as an electronic article. And so I'll either be able to download it directly, or my interlibrary loan office will find a university library that does have that, and they will go ahead and they will copy that, scan it, and send it to me, and I can just send it to you. So don't be deterred by not having direct access to it. If you know someone who is at another institution and that has that particular subscription, they can help you. And there's a formal process by which libraries can request this from each other. For my part, if I'm requesting an interlibrary loan on someone else's behalf, it doesn't cost me money. If you give me all the information, or like a link to the book in WorldCat and the page range, it takes me less than a minute to submit the request online. And then it's just waiting till it's processed, which is, again, usually in just a couple days. All right, let us go ahead and take stock of what we looked at today. So we have been exploring the topics of literature reviews, and specifically how to ground your research, to ground whatever it is you're doing, whether it's original scientific research, whether it's literary analysis, whether it's a study of something, to ground your undertaking through a literature review where you examine what has been written before, present a curated set of the most pertinent, most relevant information, and use this to justify the choices that you've done. So we started out by looking at the core principles of literature review. What makes a good literature review? What's the purpose of the literature review? And we continued by looking at a sample literature review assignment and how that literature review was used to justify other things that are being proposed. We looked at a published literature review article that available on PLOS ONE, a systematic literature review. And then we looked at the implicit literature review contained within chapters of a master's degree in English thesis. And finally, we talked about some electronic literature search resources, places where you can go to find information, to find other sources that are out there, whether they're in book form or whether they're in journal articles, published online or offline. So I hope that these are helpful. This is, again, part of a workshop series, so we'll be exploring these in greater deal later. But it starts with, okay, what is it that you are trying to do? What problem are you investigating, which could be a gap in knowledge? What questions are you trying to answer? And then how do we determine how to go about answering those through the lit review? So, hope that's helpful. Have a great day.